Welcome, my friends. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the bell to receive more videos. There's a quiet kind of magic that lives in forgotten places. You won't hear it announce itself or see it twinkling like fairy dust in the air. No, it's slower, quieter. It creeps into the corners of old wooden shelves and settles in the scent of yellowing pages. And if you're lucky enough, or perhaps lonely enough, you might stumble upon it in the last place the world expects you to find something beautiful. This story begins in a bookstore that no longer believed it had stories left to tell. Nestled between a tailor's shop that hadn't seen customers in months and a florist whose blooms never lasted long in the city smog, sat Elliot and Sons booksellers. A dusty relic in a neighborhood that had forgotten how to pause. The sign above the window hung at a tilt, its paint cracked and faded. Inside, the shop smelled like ink, cedar wood, and time. Time that had stopped, time that refused to move forward, and time desperately trying to rewind itself. It was a bookstore in the final stretch of its life. Rent notices gathered like leaves at the front door. The register clicked less and less each week. The once faithful customers, teachers, collectors, lovers of worn covers, had long since migrated to cheaper digital worlds. The city moved faster now, and the shop could no longer keep up. But there was one soul who still believed in the place. Her name was Clara. She wasn't the owner, nor the daughter of the owner. In fact, no one quite remembered why she started working there. She had simply appeared one spring afternoon years ago, asking if the shop needed help. And though the shop didn't, not really, the old man behind the counter had said yes. Maybe it was her eyes, the kind that looked like they carried entire libraries inside them. Or maybe it was the silence she carried with her like a second skin. Whatever it was, she became part of the furniture almost instantly. Clara was not loud. She never tried to sell you something you didn't ask for. She wore cardigans too big for her and always kept a pencil behind her ear, even though she rarely took notes. Her hair was usually tied back in a messy bun, and her hands often smelled faintly of ink. She walked through the narrow aisles like she belonged to them, as if she'd grown roots between the encyclopedias and forgotten poetry anthologies. Her life was quiet, repetitive, safe. Mornings were for wiping down counters, rearranging displays no one looked at, and flipping the sign on the door to open. Afternoons were slower. She'd read, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently, or traced the spines of books like old friends. And evenings, well, evenings were when the shop felt loneliest. The sun would slant through the front windows in long golden lines, and the air would grow heavy with stillness. That was when she'd retreat to her favorite spot, a velvet armchair hidden behind the travel section, where the world's edges softened, and fiction felt more real than reality. She didn't have many friends, or perhaps any at all, but she didn't seem to mind. The books were enough. They didn't ask questions. They didn't make her explain herself. They just listened. But all stories, even quiet ones, are destined for change. Sometimes it creeps in like fog. Sometimes it knocks on the door. And sometimes it walks in one Saturday morning without warning. With a worn coat, a quiet voice, and a gaze that makes you forget how to breathe. That's what happened to Clara. It was a Saturday like any other. The rain had been soft that morning, tapping gently on the glass as if asking permission to stay. Clara had just opened the shop and was halfway through her second cup of coffee when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, her fingers still wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. A man walked in. He was neither particularly tall nor particularly striking. His coat was a little too large, and his scarf was tucked in hastily, as though he dressed in a hurry. His hair was dark, slightly damp from the rain, and curled at the ends. But his eyes scanned the room, not like a stranger, but like someone returning home after a long absence. He didn't speak. He simply walked quietly, deliberately, to the back of the shop toward the fiction section. Clara watched him go, heart inexplicably stirred. There was something about the way he moved. Not like someone browsing, but someone searching. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, he returned to the front desk, holding a single book in his hands. The Garden of Words, a novel that hadn't sold in years. He placed it gently on the counter. Clara glanced at the title. Den Appetit. Is this a gift? She asked, her voice as soft as the rain outside. He paused, then offered a small smile. In a way, that was all. He paid in cash, took the book, and left with a nod. The bell jingled again as the door closed behind him. Clara stood there for a long moment, her fingers brushing the counter where the book had been. There was something unsettling about it. Not in a bad way, but like hearing a familiar melody in a place you'd never expect. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that he would return, or that every Saturday for the next few weeks he'd walk in and buy that same book in a different edition each time. That with each visit, her heart would anticipate the jingle of the bell more than the turning of a page. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, we stay in this moment, in the quiet hum of a dying bookshop, in the presence of a woman who had grown used to silence, and the man who had unknowingly cracked it. The world outside kept rushing. Rent notices still gathered like dust. The city still blinked in neon and honked in frustration. But inside Elliot and Sons, a single heartbeat began to echo a little louder. And somewhere in the quiet between two worn pages, a new story had already begun to write itself. Some habits bloom without us ever noticing. They begin quietly, like a breeze shifting the curtain, or the way your hand finds your favorite mug each morning without thinking. And by the time you realize something has changed, it's already a part of your rhythm. Essential, expected. That's what happened with the man in the book. He returned the following Saturday. The rain had cleared that week, replaced by the crisp coolness of early autumn. Clara was dusting the windowsill when she heard the bell above the door, and before she even turned around, something in her stilled. She knew it was him. Same coat, same scarf, same quiet gaze. He offered her a polite nod. Not overly familiar, not distant. The kind that says, "We're strangers, but I remember you." He made his way back to the same section without a word. Clara found herself pretending to be busy behind the register, but really her eyes followed him, watching, wondering. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and then he returned. This time holding a different edition of the Garden of Words. This one had a navy blue dust jacket and worn corners. Clara blinked. She remembered shelving that copy herself months ago, sliding it into the middle row where old titles went to sleep. He placed it on the counter gently, as though it were made of glass. Clara cleared her throat. "You bought this last week, didn't you?" He smiled, not sheepish, but amused. "Not this one." She raised an eyebrow. "Different edition?" He nodded. "They're never the same twice." And just like that, he left. Book in hand, leaving behind the scent of rain and mystery and the smallest crack in Clara's routine. The third Saturday came. So did he. Then the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Each time, a new edition of The Garden of Words. A different cover, different paperweight, sometimes with handwritten notes in the margins, sometimes crisp and untouched. Once, he brought up a pocket-sized version that looked like it had survived a flood and fire, and still, he smiled at it like an old friend. Clara began to anticipate his arrival. She never told anyone. There was no one to tell, but every Saturday morning, she found herself checking the clock more often. She'd smooth her cardigan, brush her fingers through her hair. She'd rearrange the display in a way that made the fictional easier to find. Though she told herself it was for organization, she didn't know his name. He never stayed long. He never lingered, but his visits stitched themselves into her week like bookmarks in the chapters of her life. One afternoon, after he left, Clara found herself alone again. Surrounded by towers of untouched stories, she glanced at the empty space where the Garden of Words had once sat in half a dozen forms, and a thought crept into her mind like ink bleeding into water. Why this book? It wasn't famous. Not anymore. It was a quiet novel, a love story. Yes, but not the kind with sweeping gestures or tragic endings. It was about silence, about longing, about the words left unsaid between two people who might have met at the wrong time but understood each other more deeply than anyone else ever had. She knew the plot well, but she'd never felt curious about it. Not until now. What made him seek it out over and over? What could he possibly find in those pages that he hadn't already read? She began to pay closer attention, not just to him, though she did, but to the books he chose. The tiny details. One copy had an old bookmark with a torn photo wedged inside. Another had a scribbled name on the inside cover. A different edition still bore the scent of perfume, faint but lingering. Clara began to feel like a detective in a mystery that had no crime. The only clues were paper and ink, but her heart told her there was a story buried beneath it all. Something important, something meant to be uncovered. And then came the edition with the red ribbon. It was the 8th Saturday. He came in, nodded, as always, and retreated to the same corner. But that day, he lingered longer. Clara noticed him standing in front of the shelf, hand-hovering eyes moving slowly across the row. Eventually, he brought up the book, similar in size and age to the others, but this one had something different tucked inside. A crimson ribbon, used as a bookmark, frayed at the end. He didn't say anything, just handed it over. Clara, her curiosity finally outweighing her restraint, let the question slip. Why this book? He paused, fingers resting lightly on the counter. Then he looked at her, looked with a quiet sadness she hadn't expected. "I'm looking for something I lost," he said simply. "Or maybe trying to remember it." Clara opened her mouth to ask more, but he gave a gentle shake of his head, as if the rest of the explanation wasn't ready yet. And then he left, as always, leaving behind silence, mystery, and 1,000 questions that burned hotter than ever. That evening, Clara didn't go home right away. She pulled out her own worn copy of The Garden of Words, one she'd owned since she was 16. The cover was cracked, the pages soiled with time. She read the first chapter aloud to the empty shop, then the second. By the third, her voice trembled, because suddenly the story didn't feel like fiction anymore. It felt like memory. She didn't know why, but something in those words stirred something deep in her. A shadow, a whisper of something long buried, a name she almost remembered, a place she almost recognized. And then she knew. She couldn't keep watching from behind the counter anymore. She had to know who he was, why he was doing this, and if the story he was piecing together somehow included her. But that was a decision for another day. For now, she sat in the velvet chair at the back of the shop, surrounded by the ghosts of stories and the weight of one living mystery. Her heart beat a little faster. Her world had grown just a little larger, because sometimes the person who walks in from the rain doesn't just buy a book. Sometimes they bring back the pages of a life you didn't know you'd lost. Curiosity is a strange, soft thing. It doesn't arrive with thunder or drama. No, it tiptoes in. It begins with a glance held a moment too long, a question that hums beneath your thoughts like a tune you can't name. It lives in the space between what you know and what you feel might be true. And for Clara, curiosity had bloomed like ivy across the walls of her mind. Ever since the man in the coat began buying those editions of The Garden of Words, something inside her refused to rest. His visits were now stitched into the fabric of her Saturdays. A quiet ritual, a breath of something different in her otherwise predictable world. But it wasn't just his presence anymore, it was the pattern. The puzzle, the question that echoed louder with each passing week. Why this book? It wasn't normal. Customers don't buy the same novel over and over unless they he, collectors, eccentric, or haunted. And this man didn't seem like any of those. Not exactly. He was calm, consistent, kind in a way that didn't demand attention. But behind his quiet gestures and polite nods, Clara sensed depth. A weight to his silence, as if his words were carefully folded and tucked away in some forgotten drawer. Clara couldn't stop thinking about it. She began spending evenings researching different editions of the book. She dug through inventory logs, cross-referenced publication years, print runs, cover artists. She discovered that The Garden of Words had gone through 11 editions in total. A modest number for a modest novel. But what struck her most was how varied they were. Each one slightly different, not just in design, but in tone. As if each edition carried its own mood, its own personality. That fascinated her. She started reading the novel again, but this time, she didn't just read it. She studied it, one edition at a time, comparing lines, noticing subtle shifts in translation, paragraph spacing, punctuation. Some had intros by different authors. Others contained handwritten notes, dedications from strangers long gone. But one thing remained the same in every version. The core of the story, A tale of two people who meet by chance, a brief encounter, a conversation that becomes a memory, and a bond that lingers. Unspoken but unforgettable. It wasn't a dramatic story. No car crashes, no sweeping declarations, just moments. Quiet, beautiful, aching moments. Like life, and with every edition she read, Clara felt the story wrapping itself around her, not just as fiction, but as something else, something personal. She didn't know how or why, but a thought began to take root. This story was connected to the man, and the man might be connected to her. One Sunday morning, the shop closed and the streets still waking. Clara stood in the back room, surrounded by the remaining copies of The Garden of Words. She'd gathered them all from the shelves, placed them on the table like puzzle pieces. 11 editions, 8 already sold to him. Only 3 left. She opened each one, page by page, looking for anything that might explain his obsession. The third book she opened had a tear on page 94, a deep diagonal slice, like a knife had once nicked it. She traced it with her finger. On the torn edge, someone had written something in pencil, now nearly faded. Found you once, will find you again. She froze. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, unfamiliar, and yet oddly familiar. She flipped to the inside cover. No name, no date. Just a tiny pressed flower tucked beneath the dust jacket. Pale, purple, dry as memory. Clara's hands trembled. This was no coincidence. She rushed back to the front of the shop, fished out the ledger. An old-fashioned notebook where they recorded cash sales. The man never used credit, never left a name. But maybe, just maybe, she could trace the editions he'd bought. She found them listed by date, a line for each Saturday, no customer name, just a title and a price. Each entry had a note beside it, her own shorthand scribbles, red jacket, worn edges, pocket edition, blue ink on last page, leather bound, gold embossed, ribbon marker, faded red. She flipped back and forth, comparing her notes with the books still in the store, trying to find connections, a pattern, a message. Then she saw it. Each edition he bought was slightly older than the last. He was moving backward. Chronologically, from the most recent reprint to the earliest, first published version. It was like he was peeling away layers, uncovering something buried beneath time, or remembering. Clara sat down hard in the velvet chair, heart pounding. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet, but she was sure of one thing. He wasn't just collecting books. He was retracing steps, looking for something lost. And somehow, those steps led him back to her shop. Again and again. As if he was following a breadcrumb trail made of words and dust and dicey vu. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She dreamed of bookstores that smelled like rain, of pages turning in slow motion, of a younger version of herself, one she barely remembered, sitting at a train station with a book in her lap and a stranger beside her, talking about metaphors. When she awoke, the dream dissolved like smoke, but the feeling stayed with her. Familiar, ache-like. She pulled out her old journals, the ones she hadn't touched in years, flipped through them, mostly dull entries. Bookstore hours, quotes she loved, random thoughts. But then, in one near the back, scribbled between coffee stains and a half-written poem, she found this line: "Met a boy in Florence, talked about books, never asked his name." She stared at it. Florence, years ago, a study trip, maybe a summer when she was 19 or 20, a blur of cathedrals and cheap espresso. Could it be? No. It was too far-fetched, and yet the line in the torn book echoed in her ears. Found you once, will find you again. The next Saturday, she waited. She didn't bother pretending anymore. She brewed 2 cups of tea instead of 1. She cleared the counter. She wore her favorite cardigan, the one that reminded her of autumn leaves and old stories. When he entered right on Jimmy, something in his face shifted, as if he, too, had finally decided it was time for something more. He walked up to the counter, holding a worn green edition. Before he could say anything, Clara spoke. "This one," she said, voice steady, "has a note in the margins. Page 42. Something about a rooftop and poetry." He paused, then smiled. Softer this time. A smile touched by memory. "I know," he replied. "I left it there." Clara's breath caught. The air between them thickened. Not with tension, with recognition. She didn't need to ask. Not yet. The questions could wait, but her curiosity, once a whisper, was now a full symphony, playing in time with her heart. She was ready to listen, because sometimes the answers don't come all at once. Sometimes they arrive like pages turning slowly, carefully, until the full story reveals itself. There are stories we forget we've lived. They don't vanish. They lie dormant, pressed between years, like petals in a closed book, dry, delicate, waiting for the right hands to find them again. For Clara, the bookstore had always been a sanctuary, but now it was becoming something else. A mirror, a compass, a doorway she hadn't even known was closed, slowly swinging open. Ever since the man had admitted in that soft Saturday moment, "I left it there," her world had started to shift, not with chaos, not with revelation, but with remembrance, quiet, tentative, sacred. She didn't ask him anything more that day, didn't need to. The look in his eyes had said enough. Not just "I remember," but "you remember too, don't you?" And the truth was, she did. Not clearly, not completely, but something inside her had begun to glow, like a lighthouse blinking through fog, distant, faint, yet undeniably there. That night, long after the last customer left and the streetlights flickered on outside, Clara returned to the table in the back room, where the remaining editions of the Garden of Words sat like silent witnesses. She reached for the earliest one, the original edition, faded green cloth cover, no dust jacket, gold title barely legible on the spine. She ran her hand over it as if touching an old friend's face. She opened it slowly, carefully, the paper dry and fragile with time. Inside the cover was a name handwritten in ink. Not his name, not hers, just the first name, Eva. It meant nothing to her, but tucked 3 pages in, she found something that did. A letter, folded crisply, preserved perfectly as though it had been waiting. Its edges yellowed, but its contents untouched. There was no envelope, just the letter itself slipped between chapter titles like a secret whispered into the binding. Clara unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, slanted, the same script she had seen in the margin. Note on page 94. Found you once, will find you again. She read it once, then again, slower, aloud, to the echo of the empty shop. If you ever find this, if somehow, across the miles and the years and the coincidences, then maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Maybe we were always meant to meet again. I remember your voice more than your face. I remember the question you asked about happy endings, and the way you looked at the train timetable like it was a map to another life. I never got to tell you that I waited, but you never came back, and I've been waiting ever since. Clara sat motionless. She felt the walls of her life shift around her, gently, like tectonic plates rediscovering their places. That letter wasn't addressed to anyone, but it was for someone, and every word vibrated with something familiar. Not in the brain, but in the bones, in the soul. She closed the book, breathed, and then, without quite realizing why, she turned off the lights, locked the shop, and walked toward the place she hadn't visited in years. Her old storage unit. She hadn't been there since before the pandemic. It was where she kept boxers from her university days. Sketchbooks, ticket stubs, photographs of people whose names she no longer remembered. It took her an hour to find what she was looking for. A leather-bound journal, cracked at the edges. One she had once carried everywhere. She flipped through it, page after page, until she found it. A memory scribbled hastily beneath a train station receipt dated 9 years ago. Florence, June. A boy with a paperback. We argued about the ending of a novel I've already forgotten, but he said something that stuck with me. Books are just time machines. Some take you forward. The best ones take you back. She stared at those words, not because they were poetic, but because they were his. She knew it now. The man in the shop, the man with the coat and the scarf and the searching eyes. They had met in another country, in another life. If only 4 minutes, a fleeting moment. Forgotten. Or so she thought, but he hadn't forgotten. Not entirely. And neither had she. The next Saturday, she waited differently. Not with idle curiosity, but with urgency, with hunger. She didn't clean the counter or rearrange displays. She simply sat with the letter in her lap, the journal beside her, and a question burning in her chest. What do we do with a memory that returns too late? The bell above the door chimed. Right on, Jimmy. He entered like always, but this time he paused. She was already standing, holding the book, the letter, the journal. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He approached slowly, eyes locked with hers. And then she held out the letter. His hand shook as he took it. He read it once quietly, lips moving, heart heavy, then looked up at her. And for the first time, there were tears in his eyes. I wrote this for someone I thought I'd lost, he said, but I never imagined I'd find her again in the same place I left her. Clara blinked. You didn't leave me. I just didn't know we were supposed to meet again." He smiled gently, as if that was enough. They sat, then, in the back of the shop, in the velvet chair and the cracked leather armchair opposite it. No customers came. No one interrupted, and for the first time since their quiet dance had begun, they spoke without hiding. He told her about Florence, how he had traveled alone that summer, how he had wandered into a bookshop to escape the heat, and there she was, sitting on the floor, arguing with a clerk about a novel's ending. He had stepped in. She had rolled her eyes. They had laughed, talked, shared a bench at the station, and then she had left. No numbers, no names, just a memory. He'd searched for her in bookstores ever since. Not always consciously, but every time he saw the garden of words, he felt her shadow. And one day, years later, he saw that same book in the window of Elliot and Sons. So he walked in, and there she was. Different, older, quieter, but still her. Clara sat in silence, her hands clasped around a mug of tea gone cold. She didn't know what to say or what came next, but she knew one thing. Their story wasn't over. It had never really ended. It had just fallen asleep like a book waiting on a shelf, gathering dust, until someone returned to finish it. And now, page by page, it was waking up again. Some memories hide not in photographs, not in journals, not in dusty boxers or saved voicemails, but somewhere stranger, deeper, in moments, in smells, in lines of a book reread too many times, in the way a stranger's voice can make your heart hesitate, not from fear, but from recognition. That was how Clara felt as she sat across from him. The man whose name she now learned was Adrian was no longer a mystery wrapped in routine. He was a memory unfolding itself, one slow sentence at a time. The letter she'd found had opened something in both of them. Not just their past, but a truth neither had dared name until now. That one brief encounter years ago in a city far away had left a mark neither could erase. Adrian explained it first. Back then, he'd been 23, a wandering heart with too many books and no plan. He'd met Clara in a Florence bookshop on a humid afternoon, both of them sheltering from the sun among shelves that smelled like ink and leather. They hadn't meant to talk. They were just two travelers resting, but something about her, the way she tilted her head while reading, or how she furrowed her brow at a poorly written ending, had drawn him in. They began to talk, first about books, then about everything else. They shared coffee on the steps of the train station, laughed about life, traded quotes from novels like Secrets, and then it ended. No exchange of names, no photos, just the passing comment that if fate existed, maybe they'd meet again. He had thought she'd show up the next day. She hadn't anything. He'd waited 2 hours. Then his train left. And so began his search. A quiet, private ritual spanning years. He would step into bookstores in every city he traveled to, looking not for her, but for a feeling, a spark, a trace, and always, always, the garden of words was there, sometimes prominently displayed, sometimes buried in the back, but it would find him, like a thread refusing to snap. So he began collecting it, edition by edition, a paper trail of hope. He never stopped reading the story. Not because he loved the plot, but because somewhere in those pages, her voice still lingered. And when he saw it again in the window of Elliot and Sons, something in him knew. It wasn't just another copy. It was hers. And the moment he stepped inside and saw Clara behind the counter, organizing books with that same quiet focus, his entire world realigned. Clara listened to every word, not with disbelief, not even with surprise, but with clarity. Because the moment he spoke of the train station and the bookseller in Florence and how she'd quoted a line about unhappy endings being honest, she remembered. She'd buried it for years. Not on purpose. Just like we forget dreams after waking. She had tucked it away beneath the layers of routine and caution and the kind of loneliness you don't even realize is loneliness. It wasn't until Adrian returned again and again that those hidden pages began turning themselves inside her. I don't know why I didn't come back, she confessed. Maybe I was scared. Maybe I thought it wasn't real, but I remembered you in pieces, in feelings. I just didn't know what to do with it. They sat in silence after that, not awkward, sacred, as if neither wanted to ruin the spell. Outside, the wind carried leaves down the street like little messengers of change. Inside, time paused, and then Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded page. It was yellowed, torn at the edge. He slid it across the table. Clara opened it slowly, recognized the passage immediately. It was from the Garden of Words, the final paragraph, underlined in fading ink. Some people pass through our lives like comets, brilliant, sudden, unforgettable. And if we're lucky, they return not to finish the story, but to remind us that it never ended. Her heart clenched. She looked at him. I kept this page, he said, because it was the one I was reading when I met you the first time. I never finished the rest of the book. Not until now. She swallowed hard. And did it end the way you hoped? He hesitated, then smiled. No, it ended better. The next few weeks passed differently. Adrian no longer came in only on Saturdays. He stopped by on Tuesdays too, then Thursdays. Sometimes he helped her unpack new arrivals. Other times they read silently in the back of the store, sharing passages aloud like lullabies. Customers began to notice the change. The shop felt warmer, brighter, more alive. Clara smiled more often, not wide, toothy grins, but soft, content ones, like the kind you give when a melody finds its way back into your head. Adrian never pushed. He never asked what came next. He simply stayed. Clara, for her part, stopped trying to make sense of it. Love, or whatever this was, wasn't a story that needed structure. It didn't follow a 3-act arc or rely on rising action and a satisfying climax. It was more like poetry, repetitive, rhythmical, meaning more in its silence than its words. And yet, she couldn't help wondering what this all meant for the bookstore. It was still struggling. Rent notices came like clockwork. The few loyal customers weren't enough. And as much as she wanted to believe that love could save everything, she knew it might not save this. But Adrian had an idea. One afternoon, he came in holding a small parcel. Inside was a pristine copy of The Garden of Words, the rarest edition yet. A first printing with handwritten annotations from the original author, found in a collector's shop in London. "I want to donate it," he said. "To the shop?" Clara blinked. "It's worth a fortune." He nodded. "I know." She shook her head. "Why would you?" "Because this place gave me something worth more." That evening, they put the book on display in the window. A small note beside it read, "This is not just a book. It is a memory, a moment, a second chance." People began to stop, then enter, then ask questions. The story spread. Not of Clara and Adrian exactly, but of the shop that held a love story between its shelves. Traffic increased. So did sales, and slowly the shop began to breathe again. But none of it compared to the real miracle, not the rising foot traffic, not the historic book, but the moment Clara realized that every edition Adrian had bought, every version he'd sought, had led him not to the book, but to her. She had been the story all along. The lost chapter, the unfinished line, the underline he couldn't forget. And now, as they sat together on a rainy evening, surrounded by books that once collected dust and now whispered joy, Clara knew. Some stories are fiction, but the best ones, the ones written between the lines, are lived. There is a moment just before something begins that feels like standing at the edge of a sentence. A quiet breath, a heartbeat suspended in ink, a pause before the next word changes everything. That's where Clara stood now. Not at the end, not really, but at the beginning of something that didn't yet have a name. It had been 3 months since Adrian came into the bookstore with nothing more than a familiar novel and a quiet smile. 3 months since his presence turned routine into ritual, curiosity into memory, silence into conversation. Since then, something beautiful had unfolded. Slowly, like pages turning in a book they were writing together without even knowing it. The bookstore, Elliot and Sons, was no longer the still, dusty museum it had been. It had changed, not in ways that newspapers or investors would write about, but in the ways that mattered. The air was warmer. The silence was no longer heavy. It hummed with anticipation, with the kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from presence, from being with someone who makes the silence feel full. Customers came more often now. Some to browse, some to listen, others simply to sit, as if they could sense something sacred in the air. Word had spread about the rare edition of The Garden of Words in the window, a love story tied to a pair of strangers who had found each other again after years apart. Clara and Adrian never confirmed the rumors. They never denied them either. Some truths are stronger when left unspoken. One Thursday morning, as the first autumn frost painted silver on the shop windows, Clara turned the open sign with a soft smile. Adrian was already there, curled in his usual chair in the corner, reading a thick anthology of poetry. He looked up as she entered. "You're early," he said, sipping from his mug. She shrugged. "So are you." He grinned. "We're becoming predictable." She laughed. Not loudly, but with the kind of ease that only comes when laughter is shared with someone who knows your silences. They didn't need much conversation anymore. Their days moved gently around each other, like sentences in a well-paced paragraph. Independent, but always connected. One day, a girl came in, no older than 16, with trembling hands and nervous eyes. She approached the counter and asked, "Do you sell books about second chances?" Clara smiled softly. "All of them," she said. "If you read closely enough." That night, Clara sat beside Adrian on the small love seat near the fiction section. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and the scent of old paper filled the space like an old lullaby. He turned to her suddenly. "Do you remember," he asked, "what you said to me in Florence about unhappy endings being more honest?" She nodded. "I believed that then. And now." She paused, then reached for his hand. "I think the best endings aren't happy or sad," she whispered. "They're just beginnings in disguise." Adrian smiled, and then he stood up, walked over to the display shelf, and pulled down one of the remaining editions of The Garden of Words. It was the 10th copy, still unsold. Spine slightly frayed, pages smelling of cedar and something older. He handed it to Clara. "What's this?" she asked. He knelt beside her, eyes searching hers. "Let's write something inside it," he said. "Not for us, for whoever finds it next." Clara opened the cover slowly, heart steady. Adrian took the pen from behind her ear, the one she always wore but rarely used, and wrote in his delicate, slanted script, "If you're holding this book, it means you believe in something. Maybe in stories, maybe in fate, maybe just in small miracles. Whatever brought you here, don't ignore it. This book found you for a reason, just like it found us." Then Clara took the pen and wrote beneath it, "Every story waits to be lived. Every word is a doorway. Turn the page, begin again." They left the book on the shelf, never marked it for sale. Some things weren't meant to be bought, just found. Time passed. The seasons turned. The bookstore, once on the brink of closure, found new life, not through viral fame or marketing tricks, but through connection, through presence, through two people who remembered how to listen. Not just to each other, but to the quiet magic of a story still being written. Clara and Adrian never made grand declarations. No fireworks, no viral proposal, videos, or poetic Instagram captions. Instead, they read together. They rebuilt the travel section. They began hosting Friday night readings, intimate, candlelit events where neighbors came to share favorite passages from forgotten books. Sometimes, Clara would catch Adrian watching her while she read aloud, not with desire, not with admiration, but with recognition, like he was seeing the same girl he'd met years ago, only clearer now, brighter, whole. And sometimes she'd catch herself doing the same. One spring morning, nearly a year since that first Saturday, Clara found a small envelope tucked behind the counter. No address, no return name. Inside was a photo, faded, slightly torn. A bench outside a Florence train station. Two figures sat side by side, half turned toward each other. It wasn't perfectly framed, but it was them, captured somehow by someone else. A passerby, maybe. At the exact moment they began, all those years ago. On the back was a single sentence, written in pencil. Some pages take time to turn, but the story never forgets where it left you. Clara held it close. Not to cry, but to remember, to honor the truth that had taken so long to resurface, that sometimes the love that finds you again is the love you never truly lost. And now, As she looked around the bookstore, her bookstore, she saw more than shelves and paper. She saw chapters unfolding. She saw new beginnings where others once saw endings. She saw a man sitting in the corner with a pen in his hand and a story still pouring from his heart. And she saw herself, no longer the quiet woman who hid behind the counter, but someone awake, present. Written into the narrative she once believed belonged only to fiction. Their love wasn't epic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And like the best stories, it whispered. We begin again with every page. The end.